Ladies and gentlemen, this great meeting is gathered here tonight to hear the policy and faith of fascism. If you think the present system of things can really see you through, then it's idle for our new and virile faith of fascism to come to you with a new and revolutionary conception of politics, of economics, and of life itself. We have another doctrine to put before you. And now, at long last, our men of the war, our men of 1914, the grim ranks of our ex-servicemen are scared and unscathed but betrayed by politicians. They join hands with the new youth, the new generation, which remembers the mighty past. We say that England is not dead. We say that our elected affairs lift up their voices in this great city of the heart of England. That the whole world, and it is England lives and not dies.
Sì, ti vedo Falco, ti vedo Ale, ah! Senti, mentre saltello. Se la luce come non lo noti cosa vivo ancora con l'ego di chi ha da perdere troppo. Il giorno che ho mollato ora solo ricordo il tuo amico del cazzo che mi lasci il posto. Moduli e firme no, noduli in gola pochi di vita in una pillola sola. Si sono dimenticati che l'antidoto è un altro. E i miei fra rovinati dalla vita che fanno. E no che non ti vedo, c'ho il mio viaggio in testa. Guardare troppo indietro distrugge il presente. Vivo ancora con l'acqua alla gola, qua alla mano. Guarda sopra, siamo un'altra sacco. Questo mi guarda con sta faccia di cazzo. Sembra non sappia che è una testa di cazzo. Per sti ragazzi sono come la prova. Se sei il primo a crederci è come una droga. È come una droga, se sei il primo a crederci è come una droga. Come una droga, come una droga. Se sei il primo a crederci è come una droga. È come una droga, se sei il primo a crederci è come una droga. Come una droga.
So, Nigel Carlsbad, can you just tell us a bit about what you do on the internet?
Oh man, I primarily write about 19th century legitimist and counter-revolutionary thought, although I also like dabble into, general like history posting, but it's primarily oriented around putting that particular part of conservative thought in context. I mean, in a sense, my project is to delve into the very roots of conservatism itself as it starts after 1789. Ständisch, based on feudal prerogatives, royalist, ultra-royalist, and so forth.
And you've got a bunch of writings on your WordPress, right?
Yeah, I have a bunch of writings on my WordPress. For years, I refused to join Twitter as a matter of personal honor, but this year I ended up biting the bullet. And as it turns out, at the worst possible time with all the purges, I joined like shortly after the events of January the 6th. So yeah, basically I picked the worst possible moment. Whatever.
Yeah, it's been bad. It's been bad, but you and I made it, so that means something, right?
Sure, if you insist.
Okay, so I found out about you on Twitter talking about Gregor, A. James Gregor. And I think that A. James Gregor, as a liberal, still does very good work. We also, on Twitter, talked about, I think I saw you on a link on the Paul Gottfried book, which is called Fascism, the Career of a Concept, which is also a great book. I think that's the only book he's ever done on fascism now. So I want to start off the talk. I just want to start off the talk talking about historiography, because I feel historiography, when it comes to fascism, is a great way of teasing out what it actually is. So I thought about it. I think there's really only three, or is what I thought about. I think there's really only three historiographies. You got the Marxist kind, you got the sort of left liberal Timothy Snyder, how fascism works, Trump is a fascist kind of thing. And then you got the sort of right liberal, which is usually good. You know, James Gregor as case in point. I want you to talk about the historiography, and if you agree with what I just said, just go through it all, really. And what you think is the best, and talk about historiography, but then try to talk about exactly what in this historiography is fascism and is not.
Yeah, I think your taxonomy is pretty accurate. I mean, the Marxist historiography, of course, has a very long pedigree. I mean, from the very beginning, since fascism is, among other things, an anti-communist, anti-Marxist movement, they were the ones who were sort of getting the brunt of the squadristi in the countryside. So they were the first to come up with the definitions. And in fact, Anthony James Gregor himself, in one of his books, The Faces of Janus, the entire book is basically devoted primarily just to Marxist interpretations of fascism. So you have, for example, he cites Julius Braunthal, an Austro-Marxist, saying that fascism is the brutal expression of the property-owning classes' desire for domination. Now, very often you'll hear today rad libs on Twitter saying that fascism is capitalism in decay, or Georgy Dimitrov, during the 7th Congress of the Comintern in 1935, gave what for a long time was the standard Marxist-Leninist definition of fascism, and also one of the most ridiculous. It goes like this: fascism is the open and terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialistic elements of finance capital. What a wonderful definition. And right, so the left liberals, to me, what comes to mind is Roger Griffin. Now, Roger Griffin, he has some good work actually about the relationship between fascism and modernism, but his entire basically spiel is that he tries to reduce all of fascism to this single ideal type that he called palingenetic ultranationalism. Palingenesis meaning rebirth. And, you know, you have similarities also with Zev Sternhell, who actually we talked about him before in private. Now, Sternhell is somewhat better than the others because he was really one of the first people in English language scholarship to popularize the whole idea that there is a coherent ideology to fascism. And he does see fascism as a primarily ideological construct, a fully formed one, although he sees it as being a French origin, which I can't really support the whole French thesis.
And so does Nolta. Nolta talks about the French fascism.
I mean, Nolta in Fascismus und seine Epoche, he talks about the three: German, Italian, French. He takes all three of them.
Emphasizes them.
Yeah, but in the case of Sternhell, now Sternhell, of course, is a center-left Zionist, of course. So he has this very Manichaean dichotomy that, you know, on one hand, there is the Enlightenment with all of the good stuff about liberalism, progress, and parliamentary democracy. And so anyone who criticizes, for example, parliamentary representation must therefore be a counter-Enlightenment reactionary. And now I think David D. Roberts, who is another scholar who wrote it in 1979, David Roberts wrote this great book about the Italian syndicalist tradition. I mean, he ripped into Sternhell very good. I mean, he said that, I'm going to quote from his paper here, there are varieties of anti-democracy, just as there are varieties of elitism. Alfredo Rocco, a fascist jurist, occupied one pole, explicitly advocating a new governing elite as the antidote to mass-based parliamentary government, which invited electoral pandering, corruption, and a premium on short-term interests. For Rocco, corporativism was most obviously a means of disciplining the unions, but ultimately also of mobilizing and regimenting Italians for production. But syndicalists like Sergio Panunzio and A.O. Olivetti differed explicitly, portraying corporativism as a system for enhancing popular political capacity through more constant and direct involvement in public life. Mosca and Pareto had shown that, despite the rhetoric of popular sovereignty, politics had remained elitist and exploitative under the liberal parliamentary system. But it was possible to do better, especially by politicizing the workplace and expanding state sovereignty, diffusing political decision-making into economically based groupings, growing from the trade unions that had attracted syndicalists in the first place. For the syndicalists, therefore, corporativism afforded at once an alternative venue for political participation and a new institutional framework for addressing concrete socioeconomic problems. Now, we have to talk about corporativism here in brief, because this is by far one of the most misunderstood words in the English language, like corporatism. Like, you know, the way you hear it, you know, corporatism means that is when the state colludes with corporations, right? Well, no. So corporatism is a very old idea, which at least in the late 19th and early 20th century, it's effectively a kind of revival of guilds in many ways. And especially the key corporatist idea is that representation by single member elected districts, as in parliamentarism, ought to be replaced instead with political representation by occupational and trade associations. That was the big idea. So like you have the classic tripartite model where you have labor unions, employers associations, and the state being like the umpire that sort of, you know, brokers between their interests so as to contain class struggle. And you had a more like top-down approach like Rocco, where the corporations are explicitly beholden to the state, and the more bottom-up approach where corporations were intended to be the loci of the state itself, a kind of syndicalist self-government, essentially.
Corporatism, yeah, this is very important, corporatism. And it is very misunderstood.
Yeah.
There is a medieval sort of background to corporatism, right? There's a sort of Catholic background to it.
Yes.
I wanted to add that, but as well, corporatism doesn't necessarily mean fascism, right? There was
No,
a lot,
not...
I mean, I think you and I both share the view that really fascism was an Italian phenomenon, but yet
Yes.
you could find corporatism all over Europe. You could find it even in Vichy, right?
Yeah, no, but there was also like many of the post-war social democracies retained corporatism, like the Dutch. Like in the Netherlands, you had the so-called Poder model, for example. So corporatism, yeah, it's not a left-right thing at all. It's just a purely economic approach to, you know, to.
Even Quisling in Norway was infatuated with corporatism, and he was.
I mean, he was
not necessarily a fascist, right?
It was a third way, right? You know, it was regarded as the third way between capitalism and socialism for many people in the early 20th century.
Yeah, so let's get into that. Let's get into the sort of
we have to finish the historiography, don't we?
Yeah. I want to get into some of the historiography. I want to get into Nolte, Gottfried, and Gregor. That is some of the authors that I want to keep on to right now. You know,
yeah. So
I go add that, you know, you brought up Sternhell too. Now, I like Gottfried and Gregor because I'm pretty sure they're aware that fascism is really an Italian phenomenon, but I can also see the Marxist analysis. There are some good Marxists, Nolte being one of them. Now, you could not get on board with the French fascism being even a fascism, and I understand that. And I understand where you and Gregor are coming from. But if you take what Nolte is saying with a grain of salt, and you see that there was some ideological influence coming from other countries, right?
Sure.
Compare right now the sort of Marxist analysis of the class system of fascism, class and capitalism giving birth to fascism. I want you to talk about some of the truths of that, some of the untruths of that, compared to Italian fascism as an Italian phenomenon, and then we can just move on to Italy altogether. How does that sound?
You want me to talk about the class basis of fascism?
Well, just talk about right now before, like, what is true and untrue about the Marxist analysis, and then what is also true and untrue about the Italian phenomenon, just purely as an Italian phenomenon.
I mean, I reject the Marxist analysis completely. To me, there is almost no saving grace in it. I mean, you know, like Marxists, for example, they really love to throw around this term as, you know, petit bourgeois. I mean, they love that. Like, petit bourgeois is basically the Marxist term for I don't know what I'm talking about, essentially. They'll talk, you know, all about it's the product of capitalism. It's a reactionary capitalist force against proletarian revolution. It's finance capital. It's blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I guess the kernel of truth in the Marxist analysis is that, yes, fascism is a reaction to proletarian revolution. But the nature of that proletarian revolution in Italy is rarely told. The story is rarely told as it ought to be, but we should get to that later. But I guess purely
Renzo de Felice said, for example, that if you want to view it from a class perspective, fascism was the lower middle class with the upper class. Do you accept that at least?
Yeah, but of course we have to be more specific about who is part of the lower middle class. But like I said, we'll get to that later. I told you about we'll talk all about like the agrarian classes and stuff like that. We'll talk about all of that.
Right. All right. Well, then let's just stick on the historiography a bit more then. Really get into what makes the difference between a good historian of fascism and a bad one. And just name names.
I mean, to me, a good historian on fascism is A. James Gregor. That's paradigmatically what I regard as a good historian. Like almost, he's the only person essentially to look at fascism in its economic and developmental aspects, in its ideological aspects, and its social class aspects, and fuses all three together into a complete coherent narrative. Everybody else sort of privileges one of the views at the expense of the other, which ends up painting a false picture. Now, I should probably talk about Gregor a little bit more. He has a very fascinating background. So Gregor, he's an Italian American. He was born in 1929. And in his early work as a scholar, he was involved in a lot of race realist and eugenics journals. He used to write for Mankind Quarterly. He even wrote for Oswald Mosley's The European at one point.
Right, I read that.
He argued against desegregation of schools. He worked for Corrado Gini, who was the one who came up with the Gini coefficient, but who was also a eugenicist. But at some point in the late 60s, early 70s, he made a major pivot. He left all of that behind. And I think what the man saw is that, you know, the cause that he was fighting for was essentially lost because of the civil rights revolution and whatnot. And he reinvented himself at that point. He became known ultimately for two things. One, of course, his groundbreaking historiography on fascism. But he was also a writer on the American national security state and on foreign policy in the Far East, particularly China.
Asia particularly, right?
China and the Philippines. Like he married an Asian woman, Maria Chang, who herself was like a scholar on the Falun Gong. That's pretty interesting. And and now Gregor has always been kind of controversial precisely because many people knew about his past. And he himself, like if you read one of his like last books, The Search for Neo-Fascism in 2006, he dedicates his book to Giorgio Almirante, the leader of the MSI in Italy, which was one of the, you might say, post-fascist parties who in the 60s and 70s essentially reinvented themselves as national conservatives. He thanks Almirante in the preface for his enlightening discussions about the possibility of a post-fascist politics in Italy. So Gregor, he was very much what you would call far right in his youth. By his 30s and 40s, he became a little bit more of a neocon, I suppose. Like he was fully committed to liberal democracy as a system. But I think a lot of he's still writing as a kind of right winger, and in a sense, the people he's writing about, he does have some sympathy for them.
Yeah, well, that's what sense reading him. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to put that. I got the sense reading him that A, he's a very right wing liberal, and B, he's really wants to just be an academic. He really, at some point in his life, dedicates himself to scholarship rather than activism. Yes,
he's very thorough in his research, and he writes on the subject of fascism with a certain sympathy, which I found like old debates from like the New York Times in the 70s and 80s regarding his book, which I regard to be his best one, Italian Fascism and Developmental Dictatorship, where you have all sorts of professors being like a very skeptical of him because they can sense this kind of sympathy, and it really disgusts them on a very primal level. So in a sense, he's writing about his own tribe, or at least people who used to be part of his own tribe. And he's writing the scholarship as a way to remove this whole demonic stigma from fascism and to sort of, in a way, explain to liberals what his former comrades were really like. They weren't evil people. They were people who saw the problems with the Marxist emphasis on historical materialism. They made a kind of vitalistic and idealist revision to that system. They grasped that the problem of economic underdevelopment would require a kind of mass mobilizing unitary politics. And by and large, as he talks about in his books, the fascists did a very good job of achieving the goals of economic development. And we can also discuss more about it later as well.
In every Gregor book, there's a repudiation of historiography. Every chapter begins with the musty reductionist Marxists who say that fascism is a product of capitalism, of late.
Yes. He hates those people with a passion.
Yeah. And then he also mentions people who reject that, but also just call everything from football hooligans to some professor like him as fascist.
Yeah.
What he does is reject all that, and he really gets into the details, right?
Yes.
He's not. I think that's what we need to get into right now. I think that there is stuff missing from Gregor, but I think that Gregor is, if you just care about really just the facts and not pontificating or theorizing about fascism, if you really just want to get what fascism is, sort of almost empirically, Gregor is a great way to do that. But now let's before we get into sort of Gregor's conception of Italian fascism.
Actually, I want to ask you something, because we talked about how you brought up Gregor apparently at your university to a professor, and you told me that he reacted with Can you tell me more about that incident?
Yeah, I remember I wanted to bring that up. Well, I took a class on fascism in university, and I brought up Gottfried, Nolte, and Gregor a lot. And every time I brought him up, the guy would laugh. The guy would laugh at me, this fucking French guy. He would laugh. He'd be like, outdated, liberal. That's what they call conservatives, right?
Yeah.
Rich people, right? And he was. And listen, he wasn't bad. He wasn't a Marxist, right? And he wasn't. He had an understanding of what it was. But there is just a complete. I mean, listen, we all know this. In academia, there's a discrimination towards anything right wing. But it's funny because Gregor was a liberal. It's funny that you have a left professor mocking a liberal, right? But I mean, the point that Gregor makes in his books is that there's so much garbage out there. Right?
Yeah.
Because the left has utilized the term fascism. Why do you think that was? Why do you think that the word fascism, even more than Nazi, if you really think about it, became a term of abuse?
Oh, I mean, from the moment it started, I mean, Gregor talks about this, like I said, in The Faces of Janus, like the derogatory definitions of fascism start with pretty much almost contemporaneously with the movement itself, precisely because, again, I mean, from a Marxist viewpoint, anyone who retards the progress of the Communist Party is a reactionary, by definition. So, naturally, fascism being the strongest enemy to communist ambitions in Italy, naturally they had to explain it somehow, and the way you explain it, of course, is capitalism this, petty bourgeois that, finance capital whatever, and there you go. But now what becomes more interesting is when left liberals start adopting it as a term of abuse, particularly by the Second World War. And now there's a great book by John P. Diggins, Mussolini, The View from America, which is all about how you have like liberals from the Nation and the New Republic, the two great liberal magazines, who had very positive things to say about Mussolini. In fact, there's even an article from Foreign Affairs, the magazine by the Council on Foreign Relations in 1926, which has a fairly positive view of Mussolini. And the New Deal had a certain fascist influence. That's, people try to downplay it, but it's true.
Well, have you read The Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg?
No, but essentially,
I mean, he makes his whole thesis out of that. I mean, he extends it way too far, but there is some truth in it that the New Deal was very similar to what Mussolini was doing, and there were liberals on board with Mussolini.
No, but there's a different book that's even better on the same subject. I think it was by oh man. It was called Three New Deals, was the name of the book by Wolfgang Schivelbusch in 2006, which makes the same comparison, but much more competently than Goldberg. And also, by the way, fun fact, do you know about who Maurice Berdache is?
No.
Well, I think he was Brasilach's brother-in-law. And Brasilach, I'm sure you have to know who he is. Right?
Yeah, Brasilach.
Yeah, he was executed for his journal, for his writings.
A great writer, fantastic.
Yeah, he had some kind of familial relation to him, and Berdache was one of the few people after World War II to explicitly call himself a fascist. Now, he was also one of the earliest film critics, by the way back in the 20s and 30s. But Berdache, he gave an interview in the 80s, I think it was in 1984, to a I think it was a Jewish woman, Alice Kaplan. And he mentioned from 1930 to 1932, when he was a student, there was this very popular art journal in France called Plans. And it was published by Philippe Lamour.
Yeah, I'm actually writing an article on that next.
Who went on to work for the Marshall Plan. But this journal Plans, it equally praised Bolshevism, fascism, National Socialism, and the New Deal at the same time. So again, this was a very popular sentiment. Like people did not like really have this hard distinction between like fascism, Marxism, and whatnot. Like people saw all of these things as part of the same modernist developmentalist phenomenon to revitalize Europe from stagnation. And so people could enjoy, in a sense, find good in all of these ideologies without having to feel the need to make these political grandstandings. But of course, the war changes everything, and now you get right. So now you get like liberals canceling me on social media is fascism, right?
There's an author who I can't remember right now. He's like a very militant neoconservative Jew. He said that one of the reasons why it inflames liberals so much, the word fascism, and why it's used as a term of abuse, is exactly that they are insecure about when fascism and liberalism were linked. And if you think about fascism is an inherently very elitist ideology. However, there is, that Marxist influence. There is some understanding that you need to be egalitarian, especially towards the masses. Sounds very much like liberalism. And I start to think about Benedito Croce, and I start to think about Ortega y Gasset, right? There was this past. And I think that the liberals are insecure about it. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Is that the main reason why they use it as a term of abuse? That's probably a reason. I don't think it's the main reason. I think that there's just I think that fascism was just such an emotional ideology that it even makes liberals emotional, and they get emotional about it.
I mean, they've been primed to think of fascism as being some kind of synonym to like, violence, savagery, war, imperialism. So yes, it really takes them on a very primal level. I do think you're right, though. Like there is a kind of liberals do have a kind of insecurity about fascism, since again, this reminds me actually about the Bolsheviks during the Third Period. This was the Communist Party line from about 1928 to 1935 or something like that, which is when the Bolsheviks started referring to social democrats as social fascists, which is absolutely hilarious. I regard this to be the highlight of all of Marxism. Like to me, calling social democrats fascists is just, it's awesome. I approve 100%. I love it.
It's Stalin. I think it was Stalin.
Yeah, Stalin himself. Yeah, social fascism. I love it. But the funny thing is, the libertarians say the same thing.
I think Trump described the Antifa as fascist, right? Which is, I understand what he's doing there. It's kind of ironic, but
I mean,
it's completely wrong. He has no idea what fascism means.
Oh no, actually, I would argue that Antifa, and I know. So Gregor wrote a book in the late 70s called The Fascist Persuasion in Radical Politics, where sort of similar to Goldberg, except Gregor argues this in a much more sophisticated way. So Gregor is basically, he's basically saying that within the New Left and student radical movements, there is a kind of vitalistic, heroic, irrationalist, and violent core that in many ways resembles the syndicalist revision of Marxism that led to fascism as opposed to classical materialist Marxism. In fact, you'll find left-wing academics like Habermas calling students links fascismus, left-wing fascists, or red fascists is another term. So in many ways, the kind of the Antifa people, very ironically, despite being anti-fascist, they are very much the closest thing there really is to a squadristi in modern American society. They very much have a kind of a paramilitary ethos, even though, of course, they're very weak bugmen as people, but they still sort of try to. I mean, you know, they're. I'm not sure. Are they as gay as the Proud Boys? I can't really tell, but I mean, that's to the extent that Trump is saying that he's not entirely wrong to do so.
Well, it's a good political move, certainly.
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, calling people fascists only works if you're on the left. I mean, if you're on the right, it's like, you know, Dems are the real racists. It's not. But I mean, yeah, sure. Certainly to the boomer con demographic that he appeals to, certainly.
All right, let's zoom in on the particulars of Gregor and Italy. You and I are both in the agreement that fascism was an Italian phenomenon. However, I think that you can definitely see influences from outside of Italy. Let's start with the history of fascism in its infancy, as in fact a left-wing movement, right? I mean, fascism starts with the left. Would you agree?
Absolutely. There's unambiguous documentary evidence for this. Like the first, so fun fact about. So the fasces, of course, are a symbol of the authority of Roman magistrates. You know, you had every Roman magistrate would have like a certain number of lictors who would carry fasces, a bundle of rods tied to an axe, to symbolize the power of imperium, the kind of the power of the Roman state as given to magistrates, right? So the word fasce is used as early as the 1880s in Sicily. There was a kind of peasant movement called the Fasci Siciliani, who were basically, again, I mean, Sicilian agriculture at the time was still heavily dominated by latifundia, by these large manorial estates. And there were all sorts of, you know, peasant rebellions and like peasant union cooperative movements that were explicitly called fasci. That was their name for themselves. And they were brutally suppressed by the liberal government in 1893. Now, this term fasci continues to be used, and it resurfaces particularly in 1914 as a kind of manifesto. And this manifesto was called the Fascio Rivoluzionario di Azione Internazionalista. This was in October 5th, 1914. It was signed by many Italian syndicalists, including Filippo Corridoni, Amilcare de Ambris, A.O. Olivetti, and many others. And this manifesto effectively advocates for Italy's intervention in World War I from an explicitly left-wing basis. And what they write is that, I'll quote, "The triumph of the Austro-German bloc would be in Europe the renewed triumph of the Holy Alliance, the strengthening of the cause of reaction and militarism against that of revolution. In a word, the persistence and consolidation of those forces of militaristic and feudal preservation that have produced the huge catastrophe of today, which will produce other wars tomorrow and other ruins for the working plebs arrested in the upward march for the conquest of their own economic emancipation. The great historical contrasts are not resolved by denying them ideologically, but by practically overcoming their terms. war is not fought by ruminating on formulas or by opposing it with sterile verbal negations, but by eliminating its generating causes, by reducing its factors of strength and success. So this was a very passionate left-wing appeal to fight, to intervene in World War I, and to fight alongside the Entente, essentially. And Mussolini himself, around November 1914, comes to the same conclusion that the root of the psychological difficulty that afflicted socialists was to be found in their failure to examine national problems. The Socialist International never effectively occupied itself with such issues. As a consequence, the International was dead. We must see whether there is any basis of conciliation between the nation, which remains a historical reality, and class, which is a living reality. It is certain that the nation represents a stage of human development that we have not as yet transcended. The sentiment of nationality exists, it cannot be denied, the anti-patriotism of old has dissipated itself. So Mussolini and these national syndicalists, they effectively come to the same conclusion, and in fact in 1915, you have the first fascist party, which was called the Fascio di Azione Rivoluzionaria, the fasces of revolutionary action, literally. This party was a total failure. It was explicitly left-wing, though. But, it's soon disbanded due to Mussolini being drafted, actually, I think, volunteering, as a matter of fact. And the next fascist party would be the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in 1919. But do you want me to continue with this, or do you want me to talk about, say, Mussolini's intellectual background?
Yeah, I want to get onto the intellectual background. That's what I'm most interested in. Leftism, when you go to the infancy, the real beginning of fascism, you get there is no right, really. You get a sort of socialist, syndicalist movement, and you have Marxism as an ideology, which dies, which is funny enough. Marxism goes through a death with social democracy in the West and with Bolshevism in the East, right? It's too extreme in the East and it's too liberal in the West. And it goes through a death. And what I see with the beginning of fascism is bringing rebirth to Marxism, creating a right-wing Marxism that is thoroughly progressive. So let's start at the beginning with, fascism in its left-wing infancy. Syndicalism, socialism, Marxism.
I guess I should talk about Mussolini's intellectual development. First of all, his name...
Yeah, wrap Mussolini into that. Mussolini is a character in that world. Definitely wrap him into that.
Yeah. So Mussolini, his name itself, Benito, speaks volumes because Benito is not an Italian name; it's a Spanish name. If he ought to be named Benedetto Mussolini, but of course his name Benito is after the Mexican revolutionary Benito Juarez because his parents were both socialists. Now Mussolini, as early as the age of 18, he's already a kind of activist, and in fact you'll find his early writings in 1901. He says that for us, morality is nothing other than one of the elements of the ideological superstructure of human society, product of the actual substratum of economic conditions. Morality changes as the economy changes. But soon after, now very early in his intellectual development, he encounters the Italian syndicalist thinker Giuseppe Prizzolini in 1902. And Prizzolini talked about that, syndicalism understands history to be the result of the willed action of human beings who leave the impact of their transformative power on things and institutions. Syndicalism does not deny economic necessity, but supplements that necessity with a willed ethical conscience. And so Mussolini around 1903 or 1904, he's a student in Switzerland, in the University of Lausanne. But he also attended libraries in Geneva, and in fact, we actually know what books he was reading, and I'm gonna cite them. So in Mussolini in Geneva, he was reading, for example, Henri Lichtenberger, who was a commentator on Nietzsche. He read Nietzsche himself, of course, and he read Arturo Labriola, a revolutionary syndicalist. But another very interesting thing is Mussolini read the works of two philosophers who are almost entirely forgotten in our day. And one of them is Jean-Marie Guyot. And this is a very fascinating character because what this man tried to do essentially was he tried to create a kind of a neo-Epicurean system of ethics. Basically, an idea of ethics without obligation and sanction, without any higher court above human life, demanding that metaphysical rules should be followed. An ethics of life itself. It's essentially a kind of a vitalistic, hedonistic ethics based on the passions of the individual subject without formal restraint from a higher power. And this kind of a language certainly would have been influential on Mussolini, and especially when you characterize, the whole influence of Georges Sorel. But before I get to Sorel, back on Mussolini's syndicalist background, so Mussolini, in 1909, he becomes an activist in Trentino, which today is in Italy, but back then it was actually a city in Austria-Hungary, the county of Tyrol. And he was a very strong anti-clerical propagandist. He wrote a book about the Bohemian reformer in the 15th century, Jan Hus. He was a staunch enemy of the Catholic Church. In fact, the Labor Secretariat of Trentino in 1909, he mentions about Mussolini. He says that the choice could not be better, for not only is Benito Mussolini a seasoned campaigner, he is also a fervent propagandist who specializes in anti-clericalism. He is an educated young man, and what is more, to the great advantage of our movement, speaks perfect German. Now, at this point, there's a book about this Mussolini, 1883 to 1915, which is all about his youth, from which I'm quoting. It was published in 2016. For Mussolini at this point, class struggle became a battle between the elites that existed within the same political party and a mortal conflict with the bourgeoisie. It was a social war that could only end in violence, a bloody duel between the forces of conservatism and those of the future. This celebration of violence by the young socialist Mussolini seems to have its origins in the anarchistic, insurrectional, and workerist ideas of early socialism, rather than in syndicalism itself. Now, this book actually, it kind of disputes Sorel's influence. We will get to that too. Now, Sorel, on the other hand, always stressed the profound difference between syndicalism and Jacobinism. The working class was to achieve power not through sudden uprisings, but thanks to the slow penetration of workers' customs in the same way Christianity did in the Roman Empire. Thus, the anti-Jacobinism of Sorel and of his followers, Berth and Lagardelle, was very deeply rooted. Conversely, Mussolini, the socialists, who would love to have been called the Marat of the proletariat, laid claim to a Jacobin tradition modernized by Blanquism, which for a time was also widespread in Italy. Also very telling is the image of the insurrectional storm that harkens back to the traditional language of Blanquism. It was certainly not Sorelian because Sorel despised the revolutionary from France. Instead, the myth of the insurrection and of the consequent seizure of power was always central for Mussolini. After the general strike of 1904, Mussolini praised mob rule and the violence of the crowd in motion against the edifices and symbols of the presses, noting that just as the bourgeoisie had acted as hooligans during the French Revolution, so now should the proletariat. And he points, and then this book also points out that even as an interventionist by 1914 and 1915, his language remains very similar. I mean, one of Mussolini's earliest statements way back in 1902 was that when men replace the idea, the bourgeois ego, composed of petty vanities, obstinacy, and meanness, reemerges in the soul. We know that Mussolini read Pareto and even Kropotkin as well.
Well, he took lectures from Pareto in Switzerland.
Of course, yes. And Mussolini, from the very beginning, his socialism had a deep psychological and vitalist element to it that always tempered the kind of Marxian materialism you would expect from, for example, Kautsky or people like that. Or even Lenin. But, regarding syndicalism, so regarding Prezzolini, who I mentioned earlier, now again, Prezzolini published a book in 1909 called Le Teoria Sindicalista, which is summarized as, in his book on syndicalism, Prezzolini suggested that in Italy, the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie might well host an open national community composed of individuals who shared ethnic, linguistic, and cultural affinities, tapping into generic group rather than a specifically class sentiment. Such a community, Prezzolini maintained, infilled by a sense of solidarity and mission, might provide the structured environment in which the proletariat might be educated to moral purposes. Prezzolini went on to argue that the very need to industrialize the Italian peninsula, 3/4 of which remained at that time economically retrograde, might well constitute the mission that could render the community capable of fostering and sustaining individual and group morality. It would be a community in which a sense of collective mission would provide the demanding atmosphere of high moral tension and self-sacrifice that would produce the future warrior producers. That's a very interesting characterization, right? By 1990, Mussolini was talking all about, a national economic council composed of the common interest of all members, to, unite labor and industry of the state. He was talking about a productive socialism, a practical and realistic syndicalism that transcends the class struggle so as to achieve the interests of production. Do you want me to talk about Sorel or?
Yeah, let's get into Sorel. I mean, Nolte makes this dubious claim, I guess, that it goes thesis French fascism, antithesis Italian fascism, thesis German National Socialism. But there was, I don't agree with that literally, but there was a influence from abroad. And the influence from France was specifically George Sorel. There was like a sort of genius to Sorel that I think influenced a lot of Italians. So yeah, let's get into Sorel. He really is a sort of central character to all this. I mean, Sorel, for me, what I've seen about Sorel, I've read Sorel, but the most important thing about Sorel to me is this sort of bringing back to life failed leftist ideologies, but with rightist philosophy. Marxism fails. Why? Because the working class, the eschatology of Marxism fails. Working class don't become poorer and poorer and then revolt, right? Marxism got nationalism completely wrong, right? And I think that a lot of people in the beginning of the 20th century understand this, and the central character in all this is Sorel. I'll let you explain Sorel and his influence on fascism.
Yeah, so not just Note, but both Sternhell and Gregor make Sorel, like by now, the argument that Sorel was a major influence on fascism is actually very mainstream. It's widely supported by just about all scholars at this point. So, but Sorel, the thing about Sorel is that he didn't really become a prominent intellectual until he was like almost 50 years old. I mean, for most his career was that of a civil engineer. He graduated from the École Polytechnique, and he mostly wrote on technical subjects until the 1890s. Around 1893, I think, he announced his shift to Marxism. But his Marxism was always a very heterodox one. Now, one of his earliest works on Marxism was his rejection of Arturo Labriola, an Italian syndicalist who held to the rather conventional materialist notion that, all political, moral, and aesthetic phenomena are determined by economic causes. Sorel argued that within Marx, there had been a present but underdeveloped current of psychology to explain the phenomenon of social revolution, not simply productive relations outrunning social relations, as is more conventional. And, for Sorel, he has a view of ethics as being a system of sentimental illusions, which are the reflex of an economic system in part, but not entirely. So here I'm going to be quoting actually from Gregor's book on Marxism, Fascism, Totalitarianism, which has a chapter on Sorel. It was in these circumstances that Sorel began to speak of labor as a school of virtue, with emphasis on the necessity of commitment, self-sacrifice, discipline, and solidarity in any productive enterprise. He found such virtues particularly evident among workers of the land, peasants, and smallholders, where Marx saw only the idiocy of the countryside and Labriola the stupidity of peasants. Sorel saw devoted, industrious, sacrificial, family and community-oriented agrarian workers whose sense of personal autonomy was fostered by the sovereign ownership of property and whose productivity sustained the urban working masses. In Sorel's Reflections on Violence, by far his most famous work, we find an entirely different conception of history, morality, and the possibilities of a restoration of individual and collective virtue. In the Reflections, morality is not something delivered by the automatic workings of economic history. It is something that is won in conflict through individual and collective effort. Virtue is the result of mortal challenge. It is something won by groups in fatal contention. Collective virtue is the consequence of the spontaneous acceptance of a set of ethical principles by the denizens of a community living in peril, led by heroes in epic battle against decadence and moral cowardice. So in Sorel, we have socialism almost turned into a kind of a moral regeneration led by a vigorous elite who, what they would do is they would employ the revolutionary myth. And really, the concept of myth is by far the most famous contribution of Sorel. But people misunderstand it. Like when Sorel talks about myth, people think that it's some kind of like noble lie, or it's like it's a deception by the elite,
Yeah, they think of like a Straussian kind of myth.
Yeah, but his myth is defined as a body of images, which by intuition alone, and before any concerted analysis are made, is capable of evoking as an undivided whole the mass of sentiments which corresponds to the different manifestations of the war undertaken by socialism against modern society. A myth is a framing of the future that encloses all the strongest inclinations of a people which recurred to the mind with the insistence of instincts. In a way, there's a certain influence by the philosopher Henri Bergson, who talked about the Hélène Vital, the life force that drives all motive to action. So for Sorel, a myth is not like a noble lie. A myth is a pre-rational motive to action that is a kind of vision that drives people to work through collective effort to undergo tribulations as a group. And the Sorel's myth in particular is, of course, that of the general strike, where you would have a massive work stoppage across an entire national industry, which would inevitably spiral into the seizure of the means of production, supposedly. And now, the thing about Marxism is that, so the conventional view of how the revolution would come about in Capital, Volume 2 and Volume 3. So Marxian economics, you have, on one hand, constant capital, defined as basically machinery, investment, and so forth, fixed capital goods, and variable capital, which is wages. And the ratio of constant to variable capital is known as the organic concentration of capital. And the Marxian theory is that this organic concentration would keep rising so that the investment in machinery would reach to such a point that capitalists would no longer be capable of extracting surplus value from labor power. The reserve army of labor would keep growing. The rate of profit would keep falling until it finally reaches zero, at which point you now have a contradiction between the social relations of production as they are tending towards a new moment, and the relations as they exist in the present. And this dialectical contradiction would be solved by social revolution, right? Well, but the problem is that even though every Marxist logically accepts the necessity of revolution, well, actually, no, there's reformists as well, but generally, let's say they do. There's almost nothing about how it will come about, who's gonna organize it, in what circumstances. There's almost nothing. In fact, Marx never really developed a cohesive view of the state. I mean, most commonly, he's taken to believe that the state is purely like an instrument of class repression by the bourgeoisie. But if you read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, he very much sees the state as being capable of acting autonomously outside class interests. And interestingly enough, Marx, in the critique of the Gotha program, he criticizes public education. That's pretty funny. How many modern self-professed Marxists would do that?
Oh, well, for every Marxist assertion, there's another contradiction, you know.
Yeah. And okay, well, that about covers Sorel pretty well, I think. How do we continue?
Yeah, well, yeah, Sorel is important to this, but I think that I'm glad you mentioned the Bergsonianism. I think that you know, bringing Bergson into it really brought that ideology back into the real world, right? Because it was being just superseded by real events. Now, these ideas make their way to Italy. You have Italy, a second world Latin country, obviously prone to the same thing that Russia was prone to, these sort of radical ideologies taking power. Let's start talking about, you know, Italy as a country during the time. You know, I mean, I think that, I mean, Norman Stone makes in his book Europe Transformed, he's constantly comparing Russia and Italy. You have these second world countries that don't really have no tradition of liberalism, you know. And in Italy, there was this big sort of British.
Italy does. Italy certainly does have it. Russia doesn't, but Italy definitely does.
Okay, fine. There's that sort of British influence into Italy, but there's a rejection.
It's the entire Risorgimento is very much a liberal thing, but
liberalism of like the French Revolution. Sorry, it's a very sort of nationalist liberalism. It's not.
It's very Jacobin.
Yeah, it's when those ideologies are sort of bound together in their infancy before they start to separate, right? So that sort of developed British parliamentary liberalism, there wasn't really tradition in it. Right?
No, like the Italians were absolutely terrible at parliamentary government. I mean, it was.
Still are.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. But
so you have this material influence in Italy. You have the fact that it's a second world country, and then you also have, you know, a cultural influence. It's Latin, it's Catholic, and it's got this civilizational heft going back to the Roman times. So let's start talking about Italy as an actual material country.
You mean what was like the economic state of Italy during like the early 20th century?
But also like the actual culture. You know, I mean, Marxists deny culture. There are certain Italian characteristics that played their way into Italy. I mean, there are certain Italian characteristics you find in fascism, right, that you don't find in other places because it was Italian.
I mean, it's important to understand that Italy was unified in 1861, basically through these wars of conquest by the House of Savoy through Piedmont, Sardinia, in that they deliberately annexed at the time, the Habsburg possessions in Lombardy, Venetia, and also the possessions of the Bourbons in Naples and Sicily. And this was orchestrated essentially by Count Cavour, a very prominent statesman, and a few others who, you know, had this fairly secular, anti-clerical vision of politics, who at the time, you know, during the Risorgimento, you had this entire black legend about the Austrians, about, you know, how they were misgoverning and oppressing their Italian subjects, about, you know, the evils of the Jesuits, naturally. And, you know, when Italy was unified, I mean, the South was essentially in a state of low-level civil war. You had brigandage all over the place. You had bandits like Carmine Crocio, because the South was essentially still very much a latifundist manorial culture, heavily Catholic, heavily rural, with its own enlightened absolutist political elite around the Bourbon court that was effectively eradicated by Garibaldi and his expedition of the Thousand in, I think it was around 1863. I think it was the siege of Gaeta. It was sometime around that time. And this inaugurated a kind of parliamentary government which was completely divorced from the Italian national consciousness. You had Vilfredo Pareto has a great essay called The Parliamentary Regime in Italy. If you want to learn about how Italian politics worked back then, read that. I mean, it's just... there was this phenomenon called transformism, which basically meant that political parties were these purely like fictitious aggregates of people. It was entirely based on patronage. They were constantly shuffling and reshuffling the same people through the same ministries, regardless of any votes of no confidence. You had these strong economic interest groups that were dependent on the protectionist largesse of the Italian state. And in general, politics, there was virtually public infrastructure, there was virtually none. It was horribly inefficient. And this led to what a Italian nationalist, Enrico Corradini, would call Italy a proletarian nation. And he said this, I think it was sometime in the 1900s, actually, or 1910s, very early on. Proletarian nationalism, he conceived of class struggle as taking place between, not between social classes within a country, but essentially between productive forces in a world system, which is very similar to Maoism. And it's not a coincidence. In effect, Corradini, he almost ended up presaging all these ideas about developmental economics, third worldism, unequal exchange, and so forth. But he did so as a nationalist, not as a leftist. He was very much, one of the leaders of the Italian Nationalist Association, many of whom later on joined the Fascist Party. And so, like in this Latin culture, what more specifically do you want to know, about?
Well, I just see, when I see, first, I'll reference Mosley here. Mosley went to Italy, was an Italophile, loved the Roman history, and he tried to do the Mussolini thing in England, and it didn't work. Why? Because he was trying to copy the Italian character, the Italian culture, and bring it to a Northern European society, right? That's how I see Mosley. The reason why he memed so much is because he was so ridiculous. Mussolini was fundamentally an Italian, and fascism was fundamentally Italian. And the only ideologies that you see out there that are similar are other Latin ideologies, the Phalange, even the Iron Cross, right?
Yeah, the Phalange under Primo de Rivera, but I guess. Although again, I'm very skeptical of calling anything non-Italian fascist. As far as I recall, the specificity, from what I recall, you mean the Iron Guard?
In Romania, I don't know if you know. There is this sort of being proud of being Latin, and I think that's why you see in Romania. There's a Nazi influence in Romania too, but there's also a very sort of Latin fascist influence in Romania at that time, and I think it's because they wanted to be Latin. You see the same thing in the Phalange, right? You see the only movements that can be close to fascism just happen to be in Latin countries.
Well, because you said Iron Cross, but it's the Iron Guard, because I was confused between the Iron Guard in Romania, because there's also the Arrow Cross in Hungary, which comes to which comes to power under as a Nazi puppet state after who was it? Miklos Horthy was effectively overthrown in 1943 by Hitler.
Yeah, very.
Or was it 1944? Sometime or yeah. It was a very brutal regime. Horthy was not a fascist. Horthy was very much a kind of a conservative, effectively like Franco and Salazar. Very similar, like Horthy. He had great admirers among certain American diplomats. Actually, there's memoirs by. Let me see if I can figure out his name, by John F. Montgomery, who was an American diplomat, wrote a book called Hungary, the Unwilling Satellite, which is all about Horthy's governance of Hungary, all sorts of great details.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I just want to also mention Austria. You have Engelbert Dollfuss, who was killed. I think he was killed by the Nazis, wasn't he? And he was
no, it was not a fact. Come on, man.
You wouldn't say that? Okay.
No. I'm not that knowledgeable about Dollfuss, but the thing is that again, he advocated a kind of a corporate state model that in effect, harkened back to the kind of provincial diets of the Habsburg Empire, and also partially, like the syndicalist tradition. But fundamentally, he was a Catholic conservative, and most importantly, he was an Austrian particularist. It was Dollfuss and later Kurt von Schuschnigg, who were rejecting the overtures from, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. And, one of the big ironies of history is that Karl Renner, the social democrat and leading Austrian statesman, was a supporter of the Anschluss, of the Nazi annexation of Austria. And today, his name and monument is all across the country. Despite Austria, despite the Nazism being a taboo everywhere, people still praise their Karl Renner because, of course, he's a socialist, and therefore, despite openly supporting Nazi annexation, they give him a pass for betraying his country. So there you go.
Yeah, I mentioned Dollfuss because he was Catholic, and yeah, there was that corporatist element that I think he got from Catholicism. But I meant also bring him up just to, to bring up the topic of separating fascism from National Socialism. I just think that fundamentally they're different ideologies, economically, as well as culturally. Italy being Latin, Germany being Protestant and Nordic, right? You cannot group them in, and it's when you read the history, the very basic history of fascism and National Socialism, they hate each other, right? I joked on Twitter the other day that Hitler was anti-fascist and believed Black Lives Matter when he gave Ethiopia guns to fight Mussolini.
That's a good one. In fact, there were deliberate efforts on part of the fascist regime in Italy to start a kind of a fascist international. They had a conference in Montreux in 1934, and there was an organization called the CAUR. I don't exactly recall the acronym, but this starts from about 1930, and the reason it emerges is because it's supposed to provide a model for an alternative international world order. And specifically, it's a competitor to 4 different ideologies. It's a competitor to Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europa. It's a competitor to Aristide Briand's Federal Union of Europe, which would later on become the modern EU as we know it. It was a competitor, of course, to the Comintern, and finally, it's National Socialism. But, by around 1935, you start seeing a German-Italian rapprochement. Otherwise, from what I recall, I think Italy protested I think Italy actually, they gave support to Dollfuss's Austria, from what I recall. Like, they very much, did not appreciate, because Italy is a geopolitical concerns fundamentally. It wants to guard the Adriatic Sea, right? So having Germany enter into like Austria, and because at the time, I think there were still like unredeemed territories in northern Dalmatia. Italy had ambitions regarding northern Dalmatia, parts of the Austrian littoral. They did settle the question about Fiume in 1924, but there's still a lot of tension in that Habsburg borderland. So Germany intervening was not very favorable to their interests, right? But by the late 30s, you start seeing them to effectively unite as a kind of against the Comintern above all else, So this attempt to create a special Latin fascist path sort of dies out, and Italy starts adopting more explicit racialist doctrines and so on. Although I will point out that as late as 1934, like Mussolini was setting up naval bases to train Jabotinsky Zionists. Like,
Yeah.
this was he was not an anti-Semite at all. Like, this was not a man who had any particular enmity towards Jews.
His mistress was a Jew, right?
Yeah, Margherita Serfati, who is often credited as actually being the one to shift him to the right. I don't know how true that is, but yeah, Margherita Serfati is Jewish mistress, yeah.
If I interject you, fascism, is first of all, like the racial thing and the anti-Semitism is really not there. Mussolini bowed down to Hitler, obviously, as a good ally, and many Jews were taken from Italy. However, Mussolini himself, there's evidence that Mussolini protected many Jews, and there's evidence that Mussolini protected more Jews than Schindler, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's a noticeable difference with not even just cultural or economically, but just Italy being the country it is, right? I mean, Germany, I think a lot of the anti-Semitism in Germany is complicated. I think a lot of it comes from Germany being on that Eastern European border and a lot of Jews making their way to Germany now.
And also because
that question.
But also because of their great cultural dominance in Weimar, it naturally breeds resentment. I mean, it's to a largely like a conservative Lutheran population, it's very disconcerting.
You don't get many Eastern European Jews making their way to Italy, right?
No.
That they find themselves in Germany.
No, actually, Mussolini wrote about this like in 1928 in one of his newspapers. He wrote an article called "Religion or Nation," and he says, "Before we expose the Zionists, it will not be inappropriate to recall that Italy is one of the few nations in the world that historically had no anti-Semitic parties or movements. The Italians, good-natured and easygoing for the most part, until fascism taught them how to stare directly into the face of reality. The Italians have always thought the Jews were Italians who believed in Moses and awaited the Messiah. Different from us, therefore, only in religion, while having everything else in common: fatherland, the rights and duties. The Italian people never made distinctions. They were not surprised either when they learned that there were 3 Jewish prime ministers, and one of them was Sidney Sonino, nor when they saw the Jews ruling many delicate institutions. Up until recently, therefore, it was reasonable for them to consider Jews merely as Italian citizens of the Jewish religion. But after the Congress of Milan, a Zionist Congress, the panorama presented certain variants worthy of meditation, which are likely to impose a correction of opinions. We read, and we are not surprised, an appeal by the Italian Zionist Federation, which speaks of a Jewish people following in the footsteps of their father in the name of Zion, and which called upon the Zionists to regain their Jewish consciousness, and which states that the Jewish people will soon implement their ideal, etc. We ask the Italian Jews, are you a religion or are you a nation? This question is not intended to give rise to anti-Semitic riots, but merely to bring to light a problem which I know exists and which is useless to further ignore. From your answer, we shall draw the necessary conclusions." So yeah, Mussolini is very pragmatic about all of this. Like, he's not like a bigot or whatever. Like, he's very realistic about this.
Yeah, and also Italian Jews, I don't think were making too much noise at the time. Zionism didn't come from Italy, right?
There were many Jewish fascists, actually.
Yeah, there was Pinkerton is one of them. He changed his name. I forgot what his Italian name was, but he was originally Pinkerton, and he changed his name because you can't sell books as Pinkerton in Italy at the time. It was still in Latin, second world country. There was still, anti-Semitism, and there's letters of him telling the Mussolini during the alliance with Hitler, oh, the Judaism was on my dad's side. It was I'm not, it's more a cultural thing. There was many Jews who left that behind and committed themselves to fascism.
Yeah. There were always I mean, the Ashkenazim, from what I recall, like they are essentially a kind of hybrid admixture of Italians and Levantines. So yeah, it's kind of a. Italy is one of their, effectively, if you could even call it like root lands, essentially. I mean, if to the extent that that even makes sense regarding Jews, but you know, whatever.
Let's wrap the discussion of fascism in its context and its time up. I want to go back to I want to finish up with the intellectual history, and I want to talk about why fascism failed. So
shouldn't we talk about?
Tell me about what fascism culminated intellectually into.
Shouldn't we talk about the class character of how fascism came into power?
Oh, okay? We can continue down the material road if you want. Yeah, if you got more to say about that, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, because again, this is very important. You know, all of these left-wing theories about capitalism, about the petty bourgeois, about the alliance between industry and finance, the big bankers or whatever. You have to understand that, okay, so Italy in 1919, universal suffrage was granted that same year. Industry was about 10% of economic output. And you had a wide variety of land tenure throughout the country. So for example, in the center, most land was worked by the so-called metsadri, translated as sharecroppers or gang laborers. Each cultivator and extended family household were assigned a relatively self-contained farm with a farmhouse. The metsadria contract generally continued for decades and often several generations. In the deep south, including Apulia, which is basically, Apulia is like the heel of the Italian boot, you know. There you had also a multiplication of like small owner-operated plots, small rentiers, as feudalism, effectively the manorial estates broke down. In Sicily, though, you still had the persistence of large manorial estates. But now, as we get, you know, when the movement really starts in earnest in 1919. So what also happens in the same year is that the Socialist Party scores a significant victory. They gain 156 seats in parliament. And what they start doing is you get these so-called biennio rosso, the red years, when they start occupying factories. And this event is constantly minimized in mainstream historiography. Like it's portrayed as being some kind of a, you know, bloodless and completely innocuous phenomenon, you know, worker self-management. But in reality, there were all sorts of, you know, mobs, attacks on shopkeepers. There were the Guardio Rosse, the Red Guards who were armed and prepared to start an insurrection. And more importantly, the Italian government under Giulitti refused to intervene for a very long time. They deliberately stayed down because, you know, they didn't want public opinion to go against their favor, like happened in 1898 when there was like a massacre of workers by the army in the Beva Bracaris massacre. And this inaction, like, really, you know, ticked a lot of people off. But more importantly, we have to talk about the class divisions among the rural population. And essentially, you have several classes, right? As we said, the metsadri, who, you know, in French it's called metayash. They're essentially sharecroppers. They own their land, but they owe like a certain proportion of the produce, I think about 50%, or the sales value of the produce, as is more normal in a monetized economy. You have the affittuari, the leaseholders. You have the obligati, who are kind of like bonded contract laborers who have like special privileges, like they have the right of first hire, for example. And you have the so-called bracciante. These are the lowest strata, the landless day laborers. Now, what happens in 1919 is that besides the national victories of the Socialist Party, they start winning a lot of prefectures and towns as well. They start winning local government offices. And immediately they begin imposing collectivization of land. And the way they did this was basically you had what was called a Camera del Lavoro, a trade union chamber, which fixed everything from wages, to, hiring conditions, working hours, allotment of land, everything. That the property owner barely had any initiative on their own whatsoever. But by this time, and especially in the same year, 1919, there was a lot of land reform going on. You now had a rising class of, you might say, middle class or upper middle class peasants. Some of them leaseholders and some of them sharecroppers who often hired other laborers. You could even call them kulaks if you want. And these people, including some of the poorer strata of the peasantry, had a genuine ambition to acquire more land, to acquire more income, to effectively rise up with social mobility into a comfortable material existence, to pass on an inheritance to their families. But with these forced collectivizations of land by the socialists, you start seeing, for example, I'm going to quote from a book by Paul Corner about fascism in Ferrara, published in 1975. Anyone who refused, well, here's what happened to them. The attempts of Vittorio Pedrali of Tamara to lease his lands to 25 families were made quite vain by the response of the socialist leagues. The families who took the land were rigidly boycotted from the start. It became impossible for them to find anyone who would perform the least service for them, neither barber nor tailor, neither shoemaker nor grocer. Fires were started on their holdings, and animals either killed or maimed. The tenants themselves were threatened with death if they refused to accept the discipline of the leagues, and many of them were eventually severely beaten up by irate socialist leaguists. The prefect wrote in August 1920 that only 4 of the original tenants had remained loyal to Pedrali. One of these had taken to protecting himself and his family with a gun. And he continues, at Bera, for instance, the League condemned one Luigi Bonatti to be boycotted for life because he had bought a small holding with the intention of cultivating it himself. There was no possible response to this except to leave the province or try to meet the predictable assaults of the socialists. Alfredo Volta of San Bartolomeo in Bosco attempted to set up a club with nationalist leanings. As a result, his father was boycotted until such time as he should decide to throw his son out of the house. His crops rotted in the fields. As the prefect had observed in December of 1919, killings were not far away. They came in July when 2 socialists were shot dead by Coloni. These are tenant laborers, like bonnet laborers, during a gunfight arising from charges of strike breaking. It was the kind of incident the prefects had feared. De Carlo, the prefecture, reported that at the beginning of July, armed squads of socialists were patrolling the province to enforce the general strikes. Numerous large squads of red cyclists armed with cudgels are scouring the countryside, forcing people to abandon stalls and other agricultural work. Other casualties occurred at this time. At Cuparo, an affittuaro, that meaning a leaseholder, Roncaglia, refused to leave the animals he was guarding and was shot dead. Again at Cuparo, 2 brothers Colcetti, also leaseholders, were gravely wounded by socialist squads. An affittuario wounded at Massitorello died shortly after receiving injuries, and a gun battle at Molinellina between another leaseholder and socialist leaguers brought injuries but no deaths. The prefect telegraphed for urgent reinforcements to his police and even requested 1,000 troops to meet the emergency. But for several days, the efforts of the existing forces proved quite inadequate and the province was out of control. Prefect De Carlo described columns of hundreds of armed legisti who have committed and are committing serious crimes against persons and property. There are dead and injured among the agrari and various cases of unlawful restraint of persons. Hardly surprisingly, the proprietors conceded defeat against the strikers almost immediately. Now, doesn't this remind you of Antifa?
Yeah, I mean, less gay.
Less gay, but also like, but where did all this fascist violence come from? I wonder. It's a mystery, right? You know, we'll never find out. But now, okay, so socialists were out of their minds, which is a normal event. But how did the fascists react? So there's a great paper that talks all about the economic strategies that the fascists used to win votes and support. For example, this is from a paper by E. Spencer Wilhofer. It's called "The Democracy and Fascism: Class, Civil Society, and Rational Choice." So, the economic strategy of fascism followed several tactics. The creation of producer, credit, and consumer cooperatives, intervention in strikes and securing more favorable terms than the socialist or Catholic unions had offered, creation of alternative hiring halls to the socialist chambers of labor, demanding restitution of fines imposed by socialist unions on members for breaking boycotts, and 5, redistribution of land. In fact, land to the peasants was a fascist slogan, believe it or not, like a, Nestor Makhno, Ukrainian anarchist, but also of fascism as well. These tactics varied by local conditions. Legislation of February 1918 and September 1919 permitted the requisitioning of underutilized land for use by cooperative movements. Socialist, Catholic, and later fascist organizers sought to take advantage of the law. The cooperatives offered credit, insurance, and marketing assistance. Adapting to local conditions, the fascists settled strikes on more favorable terms than the socialists or Catholics proposed. For example, in June 1921 in Cremona, after a long and bitter strike, the fascists opposed collective ownership in Tuscany, where sharecropping was more prevalent. Opposed collective ownership of the land and offered profit sharing. The agreement was popular because it gave the former contract day laborers more secure access to land. In contrast, in Tuscany, where sharecropping was more prevalent, the fascists sided with sharecroppers in some areas and day laborers in others, sometimes shoring up tenant rights, at other times demanding land reform. In the Po Valley, where day laborers predominated, fascists created alternative hiring halls and syndicalists, provided legal services and more favorable wage agreements than the socialists. In other areas, profit-sharing contracts were advanced. The fascists also offered protections against fines imposed by socialist unions. Actual redistribution of land appeared in several regions. In Ferrara, by September 1921, the fascists claimed to have redistributed 18,000 hectares, a little less than 10% of the productive surface of the province, and claimed to have resettled 4,000 families. Similarly, in Tuscany, prominent landlords on the Pisa Plain, the Chiana Valley, and the Siena region made land available to the fascists for resettlement of landless. In July 1921, the fascists in Bologna also made land available for leasing. In Brescia, Turati, a native of Po Valley syndicalism, advocated land redistribution as well. The fascists also capitalized on local political traditions, particularly in the Po Valley with strong syndicalist traditions. Major leaders of agrarian fascism passed through syndicalism. Grandi, Butai, Torati, Balbo, and Panunzio, among others. Usually, landlords cooperate with the fascists in the joint effort to blunt socialism, but in other cases, pressure was also applied. In at least one case, Santa Maria in Veneto, the fascists seized and occupied the land in 1920. The incident illustrates the transformation of the movement. After violent confrontations with the owners, but with the support of the fascist government in Rome, the peasants assumed control of the land in November 1922. So, as you can see, the fascists had a pretty sweet deal. They very much appealed to they delivered the goods, as it were, whereas the socialists did not. So, you know, if you should vote on the basis of your material class interest, the big irony is that fascism offered a better representation of your class interest than socialism did. You know, the fascists beat the socialists at their own game, quite rightfully. That's why do you think liberals and socialists hate fascism so much? It's because they know that they got owned. That's why it pisses them off to this day. That's why they hate them.
To this day, I mean, the fascists they're willing to go somewhere that they're not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The socialists and liberals, they just it's that leftist ideology, which is just too musty, too reductionist, too universalistic. The fascists, they're able to take everything, you know, whether it's economic issues, cultural issues, they're able to make it up as they go along, and not subscribe to this dogmatic Marxist dogma. Right? Fascism is so much more flexible, and Italians are very flexible people. I mean,
yeah.
In the First World War, Italy was on the wrong. I mean, you know, Italy ended up on the winning side, right? And there's a lot of in Italian history, there's a lot of sort of deals that are made and things like that.
Yeah, the Treaty of London, the whole yeah.
I mean, and you know, I'll stick to that. I mean, you gave a great idea of what kind of society, what kind of movement we're dealing with. And
yeah, it's an agrarian movement. It's a movement essentially of small to middle agrarian proprietors and partially some of the larger agrarian employers associations too. But like they weren't just the pawns of the landowners, not even close. In fact, when fascism came to power, they absolutely decimated the landowners associations in Parma, for example, who they were all insisting on free trade, for example, but they didn't get it, you know, like they were. So yeah, I mean, fascism was very much an autonomous force. Like, you know, it uses various classes, you know, to its benefit, but it's not really beholden to like the industrialists or the landowners or the whoever. It's its own thing.
All right, let's wrap up the talking about the intellectual history here. I mean, fascism has a left-wing beginning, but it really ends up as a right-wing ideology. Now, I mean, I don't think that left-wing ghost, shadow, background, whatever it is, leaves. I think their nationalism and their elitism is very progressive. It's very much looking into the future. It's very much developmental. But near the end years, it becomes far more elitist, becomes far more nationalistic, right? It becomes a lot more actualist. It focuses more on the idea of thought is action. Now, I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about,
yeah, Gentile,
fine, is the First World War, the militarization of Italy, Germany, the fascism being born out of the trenches of the First World War. However,
yeah, of course,
you could see that there was still something. I mean, you still had Marinetti before the war, D'Annunzio. I mean, there was still something there before the First World War. But in the end, it comes to power, and it becomes a movement behest to geopolitics. What does, I mean, let's talk about what it becomes intellectually, but then what fascism as a movement in real life sort of ends up at, I mean, how it fails in the end, really.
I mean, so, like if you read, for example, the Fascist Charter of Labor in 1927, like Werner Sombart called this like one of the most progressive institutes in any like non-Soviet country. Like it's all about, the fascist state proposing accident insurance, maternity assistance, insurance against disease, insurance against involuntary employment, endowment for young workers, all sorts of promises, which were largely fulfilled, by the way. The cooperative state, which is defined as it considers private initiative in the field of production as the most effective and useful instrument in the interest of the nation. And now, regarding the whole socialism of the trenches, Mussolini actually talks about this in like an essay in Fascism and the Rural Population in 1922. He says that so the peasants took the war seriously. To say that they were enthusiastic would be poor rhetoric, but it is certain that the anti-war element among the rural population was very different from that of the urban population, who were later ambushed. Opposition to the war by certain peasants came not from fear of hardships or risks or from inconvenience, that is to say, not from fear of fighting in the trenches, but for other simpler reasons. The peasants that I knew in the Carso region did not complain about the hardships of war nearly as much as the urban soldiers. Food was scarce and they had to sleep on the floor. They accepted it with resignation, but often wondered why is it necessary to kill and be killed. The urban element tried to understand the war, its reasons, but condemned it in the name of internationalism because of their suffering. The rural element, however, accepted it with resignation, patience, and discipline. It is certain during the last year of the war between the battles of Caporetto and Vittorio Veneto, Vittorio Veneto, of course, being the final war of the Italian front, a profound psychological transformation took place in the masses of rural people who held the front. Among the assault battalions, there were thousands upon thousands of peasant farmers. Many of those who fought in the first and second battle of the Piave were potential fascists. Many peasants reached the rank of the battalion adjutant, maybe even became officers. All of them returned to the country and were overwhelmed by the civil disaster of the Nitti government, which devastated the national consciousness in 1919. But we were there to rescue them. It is certain that almost all of the political secretaries of the small rural fasci are veterans, and often officers or non-commissioned officers accustomed to exercising command. It is thus undeniable, therefore, that rural fascism derives much of its moral strength from the war and from victory. But at the same time, it keeps alive these moral forces of incalculable historical value throughout the country. The new petty bourgeoisie of rural producers concentrated in the fasci is destined to become like that of France, a force of stability, of equilibrium, of solid patriotism, a guarantee, in short, of the continuity of national life. Now, one thing about the evolution of fascism by the 1930s is that the whole model of the corporate state, it does kind of go into the back burner. I mean, it's not that there were no accomplishments, because again, a lot of people, they denigrate corporatism as being just a bunch of empty talk, and it's all nonsense to conceal, capitalism. And that's not true. Like, there were genuine accomplishments in corporatism, but by the 1930s, you had the foundation of what was known as the Instituto. Hold on, Ricostruzione. The Instituti Ricostruzione Industriale, the IRI. This was in 1933. And this became like this massive state-owned holding company, which started investing in the shares of all sorts of major industrial conglomerates. And it got to the point where by the late 30s, interestingly enough, Italy had the second largest public sector in Europe, second only to the USSR. And the post-war Italian government took the IRI and continued to use it. So fascism literally laid the foundations for the post-war economic miracle. There you go. But no one's gonna give credit where credit is due, of course. I mean, we can't say that fascism is any good. It's simply impossible. It's satanic by definition, right? But I'll be honest, I don't know that much about the whole foreign policy entanglements of Italy after the 1930s. There's a great book that I haven't read in full. I should do it someday, called Mussolini and the Origins of the Second World War.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
Which does talk all about that, but I only skimmed it a while ago. I should try to read it properly one day. But you do see them, for example, in 1937. They start signing a treaty with Albania, with King Zog of Albania. That's his actual name, by the way, King Zog. Can you believe it? He wasn't Jewish. The Tirana contracts, they very much had this vision of a kind of a continental empire across, Tunis, Algeria, Ethiopia, Libya. They had this ambition. I forgot the exact name for this geopolitical model, but it was certainly an influence.
And that outlook, that going to Africa, I mean, that was something that predated Mussolini, right? And the king.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you had the Italo-Turkish War in what was it, 1911 or something, which was when, this was the first time that a lot of the syndicalists became openly pro-war.
Yeah, that Italo-Turkish War is.
Yeah, which also became the influence for the Balkan Wars as well, because when all the Balkan Christian Slavic nations start seeing that Italy can crush the Ottomans, they start following immediately, like it's a signal, And the Italo-Turkish War. Yeah, the pacification of Libya, you had did you know that Mussolini, when during the invasion, I think it was of Libya, if I recall correctly. Hold on. Libya. Mussolini in 1937 declared himself the protector of Islam. Did you know about that?
I did not know that.
Yes, look it up. The protector of Islam, and he was even given the sword of Islam. There's this picture of Mussolini on horseback wielding the sword of Islam. It's absolutely hilarious.
Well, that's a great leeway to another A. James Gregor book, In Search of Neo-Fascism.
Oh, that's a great book. I mean, it completely debunks demonstratively that fascism did not survive the Second World War. There's no such thing as neo-fascism.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that can be pointed towards neo-fascism is I guess, what was that? His granddaughter started a party, or his daughter did?
You mean the MSI?
Yeah. That's not even fascist. It just has Mussolini's last name on it.
The Movimento Sociale Italiano, the MSI, who it's very interesting. A lot of veterans from the Republic of Salò did join it, but it had almost no electoral following until the 60s and 70s, when Giorgio Almirante reformed it as a national conservative party. He completely got rid of any remaining fascist imagery or iconography, and it finally started making an electoral impact. And when Almirante died, he passed on the party to Gianfranco Fini, who ended up disbanding the party completely and starting the Alleanza Nazionale. And in fact, he became a member of the Berlusconi cabinet, from what I recall. So like he went completely from like, MSI, neo-fascist, post-fascist, whatever. And he finally became, a fucking Berlusconi neoliberal who was openly praising Israel. That's the start and the end. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I see that as kind of like the death whimper of fascism. I mean, I agree with, Gregor says that fascism literally doesn't come back. There is really no story of fascism, but he makes this sort of point that you can find it more in the second, third world. That you could see it in independence movements in, say, Africa, or you could see it in Islamofascism. I disagree with that. I think that those are just too different of cultures to compare. And I think that because they're violent doesn't necessarily make them fascist.
No, he does acknowledge this, but basically the point he's trying to make is that the way a lot of scholars like Roger Griffin, who talk about fascism as a palingenetic ultranationalism, or fascism as a kind of a cult of heroic violence, if you use these pathetic and stupid definitions, you should be calling Islamic radicals fascists. But the fact that or you should be calling Maoists fascists. But the fact that it sounds clearly wrong to do that shows you that the definition is inadequate. He's making a reductio ad absurdum. That's what he's doing.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. That book, Neo-Fascism, I read it, but he writes more books after that, right? And then he starts mentioning China, and China's one of his sort of.
I haven't read that one.
Neo-fascism. I only read into it, but he basically makes the case that because these left-wing movements, because of the necessity of reality, move to the right, you can effectively call them fascism. But these countries lack that sort of Italian exceptionalism. That's the problem that I have. I don't like banding around that comparison because it just.
Well, no, he talked about this earlier as well in like his book Phoenix. He also later on in Marxism, Fascism, and Totalitarianism, political religion. Like I said, basically, so I'm gonna quote actually, like there was a collection of essays in 2006 where all sorts of like scholars on fascism were like going back and forth with all these disputations. And Gregor here has several contributions where he just completely decimates Roger Griffin. And here's what he says. I attempted to illustrate the heuristic futility by employing his definition of fascism, that is, say, palingenetic ultranationalism, by demonstrating how it could not be put any discriminative use. I suggested the Khmer Rouge satisfied all the overt requirements of a palingenetic populist ultranationalism. And yet Professor Griffin was unsure of its fascism. How could that be if his definition was so sure a tool? Professor Griffin has tried his hand at an answer. In his response, he admits that Stalinism, Russian communism in general, together with Maoism, not to speak of the Khmer Rouge yet again, all evidence some of the principal features of his idealized theoretical definition of fascism. And yet they cannot be fascisms because they are animated by a charter myth, which at least in theory is a deeply un-fascist and anti-fascist vision. So it appears that a political movement cannot be considered fascist, even if it shares all of fascism's empirical traits as provided in Professor Griffin's definition, as long as it says it's deeply un-fascist. Fascinating. I mean,
if the movement is Marxist, it usually the thing that separates it is it's going to be denying private property, right? Which fascism didn't do.
Oh, of course not.
I mean, Pol Pot. The whole reason why that was such a disaster was because the guy was trying to like deny, like just abolish money, take everyone out of the countryside, right? There is like substantial differences, I think.
Yeah. But like I said, that he's basically, again, he's very capably like ridiculing these kinds of common ideotypes. Like the worst example, I'm sure you'll agree with me, but the worst definition of fascism is Umberto Eco's checklist of Ur-fascism. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, that is fucking bullshit. Like, my God.
Great, good writer, maybe not on fiction, maybe not nonfiction.
Yeah, good point.
All right, so I mean, you and I have both read into fascism. I mean, we both understand it as something in a certain place and certain time.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel you can look at the intellectual history of it and take from it and sort of see, you know, what exactly it was and how it can influence us today. I think that, you know, if you are moving toward a reactionary society, you're going to need to be sort of socialist economically and very right-wing socially and hierarchically. I think that is one of the greatest contributions of not just Sorel, but Gentile. You are not going to achieve anything radical if you're not playing on both those fronts, right? And Marxism didn't play on that front. Now, Marxism was more successful than fascism, but that's just because it was more totalitarian than fascism.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to mention about fascism, the philosophical aspect of it, is the actualism. I think I'm pretty sure it comes from like a sort of neo-Hegelianism in Gentile.
Yeah, it does.
I think Gentile we can talk about later. I think he's such a big character that might need his own interview about. But there is this actualism, thought to action, which Mussolini wrote about in the Doctrine of Fascism. You can't just go on the laptop. You can't just read stuff. There's got to be a belief in the world as it is and acting in accordance to it and really moving forward in the real world with the ideology. I mean, the abstract aspects of fascism, I find the most fruitful.
Yes, and of course, this culminates ultimately, since, you know, like you have thought as action, and let me see if I can find my notes on Gentile. It culminates in the sense of national community and the state. I mean, it's actually very similar in outline to Hegel's philosophy of right in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
like,
it's sort
you
of
know,
neo-Hegelian.
Yeah. Of which Croce was a part as well, by the way.
Yeah, I still think that you can read Hegel and find many positive things about him.
Oh, I despise Hegel. I mean, just look at the guy on my avatar. Like, the guy on my avatar is the anti-Hegel par excellence. But yeah.
You know, I think Gentile. You know, Gentile was one of the, because Sorel wasn't really interested in fascism. It was Gentile. I mean, in Hegel, excuse me. It was Sorel. It was Gentile who brought the Hegelianism out. But I mean, you don't even forget Hegel. The thought to action thing is absolutely central, and it's not. It's in almost every single philosopher of fascism. You're going to find. Listen, there's a time and place. Figure out what that time and place is, and then be as radical as you can, nationally and socially and economically, right?
Yeah, sure.
If you're going to make any headway in a liberal society, you're going to have to take that on. You know what I mean? Or else economic liberalism is going to drive over you, and cultural liberalism is going to drive over.
I mean, what do you mean by economic liberalism? Because I was actually having a debate about this on Twitter with like Apex recently.
Well, you know, I mean, there's this idea of economic, I mean, you know, Marxists aren't real Marxists because they're buying all their books from the bookstore, right? I mean, it's it's this
Sure.
idea that I mean, what did Marx say? Essence precedes being, or whatever. It's the sort of materialism of Marxism that you cannot actually even transcend it, right?
Yeah, because you know everyone is purely a product of the, you know, because all morals, all cultural values are purely epiphenomenon of the economic means of production,
Now,
right? Yeah.
I may be contradicting myself because, you know, Gregor said that Marx was a voluntarist. I don't know, but certainly
I mean,
Mussolini was a voluntarist.
I mean, the younger Marx of like the class struggle in France, when he was more of a young Hegelian, he kind of was. Well, well, that's the problem. Marx is very contradictory, so you can sort of take these branches of his thought, and yeah, like one part you get to like Plekhanov and Kautsky, the other one you get to like syndicalism and Mussolini. You know, yeah.
So yeah, I'd just be interested in hearing, you know, how exactly this reading into this ideology has helped your politics.
How has actual idealism affected my politics?
Or just any of the philosophical ideas that have come out of this very unknown. I mean, everyone knows what the word fascism is, but the actual the actual thinking behind it is very unknown. And how has that unknown thinking really influenced your worldview? I mean, maybe not politics, but just worldview.
Not at all. I'm a very old-fashioned monarchist, legitimist type of person. Like, you know, my worldview is I owe much more to Aristotle than I do to Hegel personally. Like, really, fascist thought is to me personally, of virtually no influence whatsoever. It's purely an academic curiosity.
So there's no relevance, really.
Not to me, anyway. I mean, but if you want to ask, is it relevant to our time? You mean can we have can fascism be reappropriated essentially to
yeah, I mean,
annihilate?
I'm a dialectical thinker. I like to take certain aspects of stuff I like and then throw away the stuff I don't like, right? And I've done that with fascism, like I just said, you know. But I mean, if you are just a full-on reactionary, then I understand that. Then just tell me what. I mean, tell me what your thoughts were then. On, like, why did it ultimately fail? You know.
Why did fascism fail?
Yeah, because I mean, you seem fairly negative about it. I mean, tell me what exactly its faults were.
Oh, I mean, in terms of its contributions to economic development, as Gregor points out in great detail in Italian fascism and developmental dictatorship, it was pretty much success all around. As to why it failed, I mean, ultimately it failed because it lost the war. It really boils down to that. I mean, you know, they lost. They were demonized permanently. They were subjected almost to a kind of a damnatio memoriae. And that's the end of that.
It was really that alliance with Hitler.
It was
destroyed everything.
I mean, I think that even without the Nazi alliance, fascism is an innately transitory phenomenon. I mean, almost if you read like you know, Panunzio, Olivetti, Corradini, all these Ugo Spirito, all these thinkers, when you have the mass mobilized class collaborationist corporate state movement, when it achieves its goals of industrialization, what do you do from then on, right? Because the thing is, though, once you create this industrial culture and you start allowing for more, you know, let's say, leisure time, consumer goods, luxury spending, you know, at some point the sort of idealized national cohesion that fascists want to have of the state as the perfect unity of the national community, it's going to break down. But the regime never did live to see this. So if effectively the regime ended up pretty much dying at the exact point that the post-war government could pick up its institutions to finish the job. And we historically just never got to see how it would have dealt with the contradictions of consumer society. Would it have persevered? We can't know.
I also think that like they were a little too. It's probably not the right word. Some word coming to mind right now. Arrogant. I mean, Italy at that time. I mean, even now, it was not going to fulfill the missions that it had put for itself, right? I mean, they couldn't. I mean, the whole African fiasco was a fiasco. They just barely were able to defeat.
I mean, yeah, because it necessarily entailed antagonizing the British Empire, which that's not an easy enemy to take on.
Yeah, and then then once he got into bed with Hitler, Hitler said, "Okay, invade Greece." The Italians soldiers get stuck in the mountain, and then Hitler has to go bail them out, pushing the Eastern European battles forward. It really upset Hitler. So I think this idea that they were going to, it's kind of the problem with Maoism, I guess, or communism, probably Stalinism too, is that they were not going to industrialize Italy to the breakneck speed that they wanted to. The idea that Italy, either today or back then, was going to be anywhere near as powerful as the Roman Empire was ridiculous. And I think a lot of those people were, because it was such an emotional ideology, really did get bound up with that idea.
Sure. Although it is worth noting, by the way, I mean, regarding that, like the whole failures in Greece and even in Albania, after the Allied invasion of Sicily by 1943, what the people don't remember is that Mussolini was deposed in a perfectly legal parliamentary procedure. He was voted out by his own Grand Council, which is very interesting. It wasn't a coup in any real sense. It wasn't a violent overthrow. It was Mussolini literally got voted out of power, which is absolutely hilarious, right? Which goes to point. Actually, it goes to show you that fascism indeed did not achieve a pure totalitarian state.
No.
The fact that he got voted out of power by his Grand Council, how he must have felt, the poor guy.
Yeah, well, I think it was his son-in-law, the daughter's brother, also voted against him.
Yeah, who was it? Dino Grandi, I think, or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I that's why for me, any fruitful sort of any benefits or positivity come out of fascism moving forward today is going to be abstract. I mean, just historically and materially, fascism was a failure. That's not to take away from the beginning and some of the, there were some politically, fascism was impressive in the beginning, but it ultimately just completely failed because of, I think, just geopolitical, sort of just material steel history reasons.
I do have to get to that book, Mussolini and the Origins of the Second World War. Yeah, that probably should clear up the because I really am not that good on the foreign policy angle of fascism in general.
No, but I think a lot of things, geopolitics really starts to it shapes it shapes a movement and ends a movement, and I certainly think it ended fascism. It just wasn't prepared, and I'm more interested, actually. I'm interested in everything, but I'm more interested in sort of culture and art. And Marinetti, when he went to London I think this was before the war, and he was talking to some of the vorticists, people like Wyndham Lewis, and he was going on about futurism and Italian nationalism. And Wyndham Lewis, just replied to Marinetti saying, that the only reason you're here right now is because of the First World. It's because of countries like England who invested into your country, shaped your country. You do not have the power that you say you do because you are from the second world country. Wyndham Lewis knew that in the end, it was not going to be a country like Italy deciding the fate of the world. And in the end, it wasn't even Italy that decided its own fate.
I mean, Marinetti literally called himself a lunatic. I mean, like what would he do? Like he had that stunt where he would go on top of some Venetian clock tower, start dropping pamphlets calling the city like a sewer, a sinkhole, and start brawling with all the townsmen, demanding that the Venetian gondolas be destroyed.
Now,
I mean,
artistically, I love that, but politically, it's completely unviable.
Artistically, he's a fucking madman.
I know, but that's where the great all the great artists were madmen, right? But politically, it's a non sequitur.
Yeah, obviously. Although maybe our current government would accept such proposals, probably, destroy your infrastructure, That's good advice,
All right. Well, I think that we've covered like tons of ground there. Could you just again say like what your Twitter handle is and what the WordPress is?
My Twitter handle is Pompilius, so that's spelled with a V, so Pompilivs. With a Pompilius for V. It's from the Roman king Numa Pompilius, who instituted the Roman religion.
Right.
And my blog is Carlsbad 1819. That's Carlsbad1819.wordpress.com. It's named after Metternich's Carlsbad decrees against German student radicalism.
Yeah, I think you've got an amazing blog. It's technical, but it moves your thinking forward for sure.
Well, thank you.
All right.